Well, hello, fellowship. It is Pastor Brian here. I hope you're doing well. I was excited about the news we got this week that we're going to be able to start in person gatherings. And so I'm looking forward to seeing some of you this Sunday. If you haven't registered for a service yet or registered to say that you're going to worship from at home, we'd encourage you to go to the website and do that. So I'm excited to see some of you on Sunday. And those of you who are staying home, I hope you'll be encouraged by the message and the service as well. And so I wanted to read a passage from Philippians, Philippians 1:27 to 30, and then just share a couple thoughts about this passage. So Paul, he's writing to the Philippian church, and this is what he says. He says in verse 27, "Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit and with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake, engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had, and now hear that I still have." And so that first line there, Paul says, let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. And I think this is helpful for us to realize that the gospel is supposed to bear fruit in our lives and shape our lives in such a way that it permeates our thinking and our behavior, our actions, our words, really everything about us, about our life. The way we think about our lives, it's all supposed to be shaped by the gospel so that our lives are lived in a manner that's worthy of it. In other words, not in the sense that our actions make us worthy of the gospel and make us worthy of God's forgiveness, but rather our actions are consistent with the gospel. And so the way we live our lives, there should be an integrity that lines up with the gospel. And an example of this is in the book of Acts, and Paul later talks about it in Galatians. He talks about Peter eating food with Gentiles, and then Judaizers coming to town, and him sort of kind of shrinking back and starting to not eat with them. And Paul says that when he came and he saw that this was happening, he rebuked Peter to his face in front of everybody, and this is what he said. I'm just actually going to read a verse from Galatians 2. He says, "But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas, Peter, before all of them, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews?" And so Paul was saying that Peter's conduct by not eating with the Gentiles and sort of kind of going back to the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, he was not walking in step with the gospel. And so our lives need to be consistent. They need to flow out of the gospel. And in this passage, Paul mentions three ways that this should happen. So the first way he talks about our manner of life being worthy of the gospel is there will be a unity among us. So one of Paul's great desires for the church in Philippi, and really it's God's desire for all churches, is that they would be unified, that there would be a harmony, that they would live together in a way where they're working together. He says, that I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. And that unity, I think, comes out in different ways. I think, you think about the coronavirus and all these different guidelines that we have, and depending on who you talk to, people are receiving the news and kind of thinking about these guidelines and how the government's trying to work in this situation. There can be a spectrum of where we come down. And some people can think, we've gone too far on this side, or some people could think we haven't gone far enough when it comes to this. And I think the point for us here is that as a church, we want to be united by Christ. And so though we may have different opinions as far as guidelines go, one way that we can serve each other is by not letting those guidelines be something that divide us, but rather bring us closer to one another as we, prize Christ as the main thing that unites us together. And our desire is to honor him and to serve one another rather than, maybe hold on to something really tightly in a way that would divide us. And along with that, he says, striving side by side for faith, for the faith of the gospel. And there's this unity in a sense that we're all rallied around Jesus and the good news that he provides. And that's what our lives are about. We want to be about that in our church, but also we want to be united in sharing that and spreading that with those who are around us, with our neighbors and friends and family members. And so there's a unity that we need to possess that is a way in which our lives are worthy of the gospel. A second thing he talks about is confidence, a confidence in Christ. And he says it kind of negatively. He says, do not be frightened in anything by your opponents. And so rather than fearing the false teachers, rather than fearing those who oppose the church at Philippi, he says you need to be confident. You don't need to fear them because you know that their end, well, God's going to judge them, and that your end, because you're in Christ, is one of salvation. And then the third thing he talks about is that a life that is lived in a manner worthy of the gospel is one that is willing to suffer. And so he says, for it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. And they had seen Paul suffer, and Silas and others. And in fact, Paul was suffering right now as he was in prison because of the gospel. And Paul is saying, you too are going to have to suffer as you follow Jesus. And that's true for every Christian. If we truly live for Jesus, we're going to experience suffering. And there's physical suffering. You could probably put the coronavirus in this category of suffering, just from the effects of a broken and fallen world. But there's also suffering when we stand up for Christ and for the gospel, for the good news, as other people don't want to hear that message at times. And we need to be willing, rather than to fear men and fear their opinion, we need to be willing to suffer for the gospel. And so that's my encouragement to all of you, is that we would live our lives in a manner that's worthy of the gospel, that we'd be willing to suffer, that we'd be confident in Christ and in his salvation, and that we would be united as a church around Jesus. So I look forward to seeing you all this Sunday and worshiping together, and blessings on the rest of your day.